Last week, some of you asked me to use different modes of instruction other than just having to read all of the notes and all of the readings. So I figured I would use video for our Module 9 wrap-up and make the transition into Module 10. Last week, as we were talking about andragogy, pedagogy, and heutagogy, we discuss the fact that each has its own roots and that we sense that the boundaries are really blurring. So pedagogy is not only for children anymore. Andragogy is not just for adults. Heutagogy or heutagogical principles can be applied with learners of all ages, even though it's most useful as an approach to frame the learning experience for adults. So unlike mental modeling or operant conditioning or even problem-based learning, these ideas are not really methods. They're philosophies about learners and the learning relationships, and they get really messy. It's hard to tease them apart, and I think that was one of the pieces that I take away as I look at your posts from last week is just the wrestling that you did with all of these ideas. I mean, really terrific wrestling, to be quite honest. And so as we move forward, I want to remind you or ask you to think about the movement from, as we move forward, I really want you to think about this movement that we've been talking about, going from objectivist ways of learning to subjectivists. Remember, these are epistemologies, ways of understanding the world, that we're bringing in more disciplines and more ways of knowing, and that's complicating. So as an example, I was thinking about the way that Jordy mentioned it might be helpful to think about pedagogical approaches with, quote, sheltered adults. And that might be true. And at the same time, Michelle mentioned pedagogy has been changing. We now regularly see discussions of pedagogy that probably would be called andragogical. So it's that blurring that is showing up in our conversation that was just really interesting. Angie also brought together a piece of what we had learned a few weeks ago and brought it forward into this module, providing the metaphor of building a house as potentially useful in understanding the relationship between these concepts. And she gave us, the basic house with just the structure, the notion of building a house as pedagogy, and then added the design features that we get in an architectural rendering as andragogy, and then the very individual, expressive pieces that we get with interior design to help us understand heutagogy. And I thought that was really terrific, not only to help us understand as adults in this learning environment, but also that really giving us an example of how cognitive information processing is helping us learn in this course and how we're drawing pieces of what we did earlier in the course into what we're doing now. So again, we're moving toward greater levels of abstraction as we move to this kind of subjectivist understanding. And much of what we've been learning up until now has been rooted fairly narrowly in psychology, cognitive psychology, behavioral psychology. And as we move into the next few modules, one of the things that I think you're going to notice, or I want you to notice, I hope, is the contributions that we're getting from sociology and anthropology. And we're thinking about learners being situated in cultures, in rules that dominate our different settings, organizational cultures, our own cultures that are part of our identities. And so these rules are impacting how we interact with one another and how we interact with knowledge. So really thinking about the fact that none of this is clear cut. We're going to be wrestling with this knotted mess of knowledge. I like the image of this multicolored, multi-strand knot to show us that while it's really convenient to talk about learning being on a spectrum, and we've got these, two ends of the spectrum and we're moving neatly from one to another, that's really not what we have in front of us when we're wrestling with these principles of adult learning. So for instance, I've noticed that there's been a lot of comments in the discussion forums that are labeling anything that seems to be, and of course we're dealing in broad brushstrokes, so I'm not being accusatory in any way, but ideas that seem to be presenting an unstructured case to a group of learners, and we're calling that problem-based learning. If you go back to problem-based learning, you'll remember there are some conditions that surround problem-based learning that distinguish it. That most typically when we talk about it, we have the case, and the facilitator serves as a guide and sets up the learning situation and then stands back. But typically problem-based learning is longer and more developed. It's not just a moment or a 5-minute experience in most of the ways that we think about problem-based learning. And often in problem-based learning, you'll find that the teams are kept intact, right? Think about its roots in the medical setting, for instance. Inquiry learning is really very similar. We haven't talked about it. It's not one of the principles that we list in the course, but it might be handy for you to know this as you're thinking about how these pieces of adult learning fit together, and when you might be able to use an alternative word in either doing your research for your literature reviews or for your proposals, or just thinking about how are they the same and how are they different. You still have a case, you still have a facilitator guiding the learning, but typically inquiry learning can be a small segment, maybe used as an introduction to a class. For instance, I've used inquiry learning where I'll put something that is a little bit of a brain teaser in front of a group of students and say, see if you can figure this out. I am not doing the kind of careful structuring of a protocol for questioning and answering an unstructured case, but there could be multiple answers. And inquiry learning can take place with ad hoc or intact teams. So it has a lot more flexibility. So I just want to invite you to understand that there are some commonalities in some of the learning approaches that we're talking about, and there are plenty more that we are not talking about. So I want to turn now to Module 10 and help you think about some ideas that are coming up. Again, really drawing on some of the thinking from sociology and educational philosophy that we're going to be talking about. Vygotsky, his legacy is at the heart of cultural psychology, as you'll learn, and from him we have the notion of the zone of proximal development. And some of you who have been educators and are educators may be familiar with this. And so in Vygotsky's view, we go from more directed to independent learning, and this matches some of what we were talking about last week, this sort of very fluid, one-directional flow. And what I want you to know about this and to think about this is that while we owe a great deal to Vygotsky in thinking about situated learning, for instance, that was a very early way of thinking about constructivist learning. What we understand now is that learning is more like this, where we've got this recursive movement from dependent to independent and from instructor-centric to learner-centric. And it's very similar to the situational leadership model that I'm pretty sure it was Kathy brought to us last week in our discussion forum. Not unusual to see theories of learning crop up in leadership or organizational theories as well. So you can keep an eye out for those as you continue your reading. So one more connection that I want to offer you between modules 9 and 10. As we start talking about situated learning, two of the terms that are going to come up are explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. And if you've already read the lecture notes for Module 10, you'll know that explicit knowledge is that kind of knowledge that you have to use metacognition and reflection to really better understand what is it that I actually know, or how do I have to think about this topic. Tacit knowledge is the kind of knowledge that experts have. We don't necessarily think about the knowledge, it just comes to us. But sometimes we tap into it. We do. We think about, how do I know this? So for instance, looking at that quarter on the page, how long does it take you to know what it is you do with this piece of metal? I'm guessing really not very long at all. That you all can look at that and immediately know, stick it in a gumball machine, it's 25 cents. You have lots of associations, right? Taking us back to schemas. You have plenty of schemas. It is situated in your long-term memory. Your schema makes it very easy to pull forward. Let's look at another idea. Last week, there were quite a few of you who got a little tripped up by an APA citation on this article by Iverson. And I suspect that it was tacit knowledge for some of you to know how to deal with this, but for many more, it was something where you really had to reflect on what skills do I need to bring to bear in order to deal with this question. How do I cite this blog? Who's the author? What style do I use? What happens if I want to discuss the ideas that Cyberan has, but it's written by Iverson, or is it written by Iverson because the formatting doesn't look normal? So we had lots of things going on in this article that could trip you up. Now, if you have a deep tacit knowledge about APA, you immediately know the questions that you should be asking and where to go to check into it. And some of you had that immediate, okay, I'm just going to go and copy and paste, I'm guessing, the citation that's used for the module. Great solution. So reflecting on, what is it that I know about APA here happened in different ways. So as an instructor, most weeks I try and stay a little farther away from the learning that's going on. But in that case, I stepped in and sent some emails, and I do that most weeks. I'll send emails individually to different people, giving them a little nudge or a prompt, and that's when I stepping from maybe a more pedagogical approach to an andragogical approach, and asking for clarification or asking for somebody to add more detail. And I try and stay out of your conversations because without my intrusion, you all are doing an excellent job at teaching yourselves. So for instance, with no input from me, I saw a discussion strand go from really situating a differentiation between pedagogy and andragogy, for instance, about age. And you got to the point where you realized that it really wasn't about age. It was more about whys and hows. And I didn't say anything. There we have it. That's my reflections on your last week and trying to give you some ideas to carry forward from previous weeks as we go into Module 10. Have a great week.